The MDA framework is a piece of game design theory which aims to provide an alternative way to categorize video games using something known as the aesthetics of play instead of genre. I actually referenced this framework in a previous video, but I did manage to make a little mistake while doing so.
Well, I think it's mainly a matter of aesthetics. You see, players usually experience a game from the point of the aesthetics first, and then as they play, discover the dynamics and mechanics. Whereas developers start with mechanics, which inform the dynamics, which in turn inform the aesthetics. This is the source of all of these like genres. When a bunch of games look like each other, it is concluded that they must be the same genre.
When I said that the game's dynamics combine to form a game's aesthetics, I misremembered and thought that it referred to a game's visual aesthetics, when actually it's supposed to refer to the aesthetics of play, which is what the A in the MDA framework stands for. I will defend myself by pointing out that in the extra credits video, where I originally learned about this framework, the picture they create to represent the aesthetics of play is a paintbrush with a beret. Also, it doesn't help that they also have a video called Graphics vs Aesthetics, which does talk about aesthetics in a visual sense, so you can understand why I got confused. However, just because what I said wasn't entirely accurate, doesn't mean that what I said had no value, as I do think people focus too much on what games look like when defining genres. So whatever, I made a little mistake. It happens to the best of us. But when I found out I made that mistake, it also made me realize that I didn't fully understand what the aesthetics of play even were. This is strange, especially since they have been a part of my game design knowledge since the very beginning of my career. In 2014, I started game development school, where mostly I just learned different programming languages. But I also had a few game design classes, one of which was in my first year. Back then I knew absolutely nothing about game design, so this class was a nice intro. Even though I'm pretty sure 90% of my knowledge on game design is from me just analyzing video games and thinking about it myself. It was also in this game design class that they showed an extra credits video back when they actually gave somewhat useful game design advice. After which I basically watched every video of them at home. And that video they showed just happened to be their video on the aesthetics of play. Not only that, but the game design book I had to buy for that class also had a part talking about the aesthetics of play. Yet even through all of this, I didn't fully understand when you are actually supposed to apply this theory. The way they explained it was basically that you are supposed to pick what aesthetics your game should have at the beginning to understand what target audience to make your game for, which isn't that useful, since it doesn't really help you understand how to apply the theory to your game design. So ultimately I just forgot about the whole thing. Even extra credits never mentioned it again after they made the video, and I really doubt anyone else in my class did. Even when doing research for this video, I saw no one actually practically applying this theory. And after having watched many videos made by other YouTubers, and even reading the original framework, I must say that the way this theory is presented is incredibly boring and also doesn't look very useful. But then I started thinking about it myself. I thought and I thought and I thought, and then I realized that this theory is actually the most important piece of game design theory there is. And when I say that, I don't mean it's just useful to game designers. It is also incredibly useful to gamers, as I actually managed to solve several enduring video game arguments using this framework, particularly when it comes to genre. At this point I've made 4 videos on video game genre definitions, and I intend this one to be the last, mostly because I won't have to make any more after this. That's how useful this framework is. Do note that my interpretation of the framework will be different from the original, mostly because that's the only way I was able to make it useful. So just think of this as my original theory loosely based on some other theory that honestly no one should care about. Just saying. So this is the structure of this video. First I'm going to talk about how the mechanics and dynamics actually work, since most people skip them and go directly to the aesthetics. And understanding these is actually vital to understanding the whole framework. I'm not going to talk about every aesthetics of play individually, since there are plenty of other videos that explain them one by one. But I will talk about the problems I have with some of them. Also, I'll be referring to them as kinds of fun from here on out, since calling them aesthetics of play is incredibly confusing and not even that accurate. Like, just trust me, this is way better. Especially since I'll also be talking about aesthetics, the visual kind. Yes, I actually think visual aesthetics are also important to the explanation on mechanics and dynamics I intend to give. After that, I'll tell you about all the game design problems I've solved using this framework, which I'm just going to refer to as hot takes for simplicity. I've also made my own little dudes so I don't have to keep using extra credits their pictures. So together that should make up about 3 hours of video. All the more reason to get started as soon as possible. I'll start with a very simple explanation of what mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics and kinds of fun are, and then I'll give a more complex example. Super Mario Bros. Has a lot of mechanics. One of these mechanics is pressing the jump button, which makes Mario jump. Another mechanic that exists in this game is gravity. This mechanic makes Mario go down when he's not on the ground. The mechanics make up the building blocks from which the game's dynamics are created. When mechanics interact, they create a dynamic. So an interaction basically. In this case, the combination of jumping and gravity creates the dynamic of up-downing, and is one of the game's core dynamics.
I go now, I go up, I go down, jumping up and down, go down, go up. Oh look, I'm going to the left, round. I jump, I'm going down.
Of course, there are tons of other mechanics that combine into many other dynamics, all of which react with the core dynamic. And all of these dynamics combine to form the game. So a game is just a huge collection of dynamics. And this is where the fun begins. Because games have one or more aesthetics of play or kinds of fun. In this case, the fun of playing Super Mario Bros. Is the aesthetic of challenge. Challenge is all about the fun of overcoming arbitrary obstacles. The goal of this game is to get to the flagpole. There are obstacles you need to overcome. Figuring out how to do that using the game's dynamics is fun. It's important to note that challenge doesn't mean difficulty, but it also doesn't mean no difficulty. Really, it means that the game has difficulty, but it can range from impossible to even a baby can do it. As long as there are obstacles, there is challenge. Finally, we have the visual aesthetics. The aesthetics allow you, the human, to understand what is happening on screen. Games do this by tying a mechanic or dynamic to something you are familiar with. When I said that Mario had a jump, that was inaccurate, as Mario does not jump the way we do by having our legs push against the ground. When Mario jumps, the game simply draws him at a progressively higher Y coordinate over a certain time, creating the illusion of movement. Mario's jump sprite is then used to sell the illusion even more. So to summarize, mechanics and dynamics have aesthetics, mechanics combine to form dynamics, dynamics combine to form a game, and a game has one or more kinds of fun. So that was the simple explanation. Now for the more complex one. I'll keep this short to save time. Alright, picture this TF2 interaction. A pyro ignites a scout and he runs into the water. This is a sensible series of events. If you are lit on fire, it is a good idea to jump in water. This makes sense to us humans, and because of that, most players will instinctively do it when set on fire. So because the aesthetics that this mechanic has make sense, it means the designers don't have to explain the mechanic. There are also maps in TF2 where jumping in water kills you, and in those cases the devs usually add signs or crocodiles to imply the water is dangerous. Aesthetics help players understand mechanics. Now let's break down this sequence of events into its core mechanics. First we have the pyro, who is actually just a walking hurt box. He has a model and everything, but that's just an aesthetic. When the pyro presses left click, he shoots out these hitboxes, which have a flame particle. The scout is also a hurt box, and has values like health, which is set to 125, and a status, which is normal, or as normal as the scout can be.
You gotta be kidding me!
So the scout gets hit by the fire and gets the on fire status, which makes his health number go down over time. So he runs over to the water, which is actually just a huge hitbox with a water texture. This replaces his on fire status with the wet status. So you can see how all of these individual mechanics interacted with each other in order to create this gameplay scenario. But let's back up a moment and explore why Mr. Scooty Boy was so worried about his health dropping to 0. It's just a number, right? Like, does he have stocks in it or something? No, the real reason he doesn't want the number to drop down is because it means he'll be sent back to spawn, which we understand as dying. But why is that even a problem? Well, it has to do with the objective of the game, which in this case involves pushing this cart to the finish line, which is done by standing near it. So if you are in spawn, you can do that, which is why the scout does not want to be there. Meanwhile, the Pyro wants to prevent the Scout from pushing the cart, so he tries to remove him. And the Scout can push if the Pyro is standing next to it, so he tries to remove the Pyro. And it's all of these dynamics that create the kinds of fun, which in this case are challenge, because pushing the cart without dying is an obstacle to overcome, competition, because you are competing with the enemy team, fellowship, because you are working together with your team. Your mileage may vary. And then there are all of these other kinds of fun that were not included in the example, but do exist in TF2 in some form, like discovery, because you are discovering different weapon combinations. Expression, because your loadout, playstyle and cosmetics are used to express your personality. Submission, because brain feel good when number go up. So now it's time to talk about the problems I have with some of the aesthetics, and why I call them the kinds of fun. I'm not going to talk about all of them, again you can watch someone else explain each one. Mainly I want to talk about these boys right here. The main problem I have with these is that they aren't exclusive to video games. Things like music, narrative and fantasy can also be experienced by watching movies, listening to music or reading books. If you've seen my previous video, I talked about how escapist power fantasies were a big part of anime. And well, that's the aesthetic of fantasy, right? This is why I think calling them kinds of fun is more accurate. Of course, it is possible for a game to incorporate something like music into its gameplay, like with a rhythm game for example. So basically they are all kinds of fun, but they aren't always aesthetics of play. I'd also like to point out that detective stories provide the fun of solvability, even though they aren't directly interactive. I just thought I'd mention that. Finally, there is submission, the black sheep of the kinds of fun. This is because it is basically the realm of the Skinner box. Live services, idle games, most games that claim they are RPGs, all have this aesthetic. It is most commonly associated with grinding, manipulation and addiction, which makes it something to watch out for when picking games. Of course, games with this aesthetic don't tell you they have it, you just have to watch out for it yourself. Now that doesn't mean that it is inherently evil. Just that it is mostly used for evil. That's all. But seriously, it is perfectly fine to enjoy submission games, as long as you are aware of it. And if you make a game where submission is the core aesthetic, just let people know. Actually, it is possible for a game to gain the submission aesthetic over time. The first time you played Super Mario 64, it was probably really challenging and offered many opportunities for discovery. But as you replayed it, you became so good at it that you can practically play it with your eyes closed, effectively turning it into your comfort game. This means that not only can games gain new kinds of fun, but the kinds of fun change depending on who's playing the game. And now it's time for the hot takes. This is the part where I convince you the kinds of fun are useful to you, whether you are a dev or a hardcore gamer. I tried putting them in an order where they kind of flow into each other, but I may skip around a bit. But without further ado, let's get started. So I know this sounds pretty weird, but I think it's actually quite logical. Like take platforming for example. In the Super Mario Bros. Example I gave, I said the core dynamic of the game was the up-downing, right? Well, that's basically what platforming is. You're going up and down over obstacles. That's platforming. It's the same thing with first-person shooters. The combination of having a first-person perspective and needing to hit enemies by lining up weapon shots is a core dynamic of those games. The dynamic even changes slightly when you switch to a third-person view. Even games that people don't consider to be true FPSs like Portal and Fallout 3 still use the dynamic of lining up shots to hit targets. And you can extend this to many more genres like turn-based combat, role-playing and fighting games. Games in these genres share many dynamics, even if they don't always share kinds of fun. I don't think every single dynamic is its own genre though. Like I wouldn't call the dynamic of progression its own genre, even if they do tend to add to the fun of submission. Anyway, this also explains why Souls-like, roguelike and Metroidvania shouldn't be considered genres. Because those are games, and games have dynamics. And it would be really weird if dynamics had dynamics, because then you get the infinity hole, and you don't want that. I made the video where I said that games have multiple genres. Since genres are dynamics, and games have multiple dynamics, this appears to be true. But games don't just have multiple dynamics, they also have multiple mechanics and multiple kinds of fun. In previous videos, I've also talked about how games can share certain genres without being identical to each other. The amount of games that have platforming dynamics in them, but aren't called platformers, is immense. Games can share mechanics and dynamics without providing the same kinds of fun. Even if games have the same dynamics, that doesn't mean they will deliver on the same kinds of fun. As previously mentioned, Portal is a first-person shooter. It has FPS dynamics. Yet it is completely different from other FPSs when it comes to the kind of fun it delivers. Games like Call of Duty, TF2 and Halo mainly focus on kinds of fun like challenge and competition. But Portal mainly delivers on solvability and narrative. This also goes back to how many games that have platforming in them may focus on different kinds of fun. Sure, most games with platforming do offer some kind of challenge, but even then the platforming may not be the focus like with Dark Souls, or the game may focus more on companionship and narrative like in Journey. It has become an extremely tired cliché by now to compare any difficult game to Dark Souls. But what if I were to tell you there is actually some truth to it? After all, it started out as a sincere sentiment, so is it really that crazy? One game that got compared to Dark Souls a lot was Cuphead, which has been derived as silly since they are obviously different genres. Which is true, but what they have in common is that they both focus heavily on the fun of challenge. And sure, Dark Souls also has other kinds of fun like expression, discovery, companionship and competition, while Cuphead only really has challenge and sensation. But in both these games, the challenge is so high that they kind of overtake the other kinds of fun. I'd also like to point out again how strange it is that games like Castlevania 2 and Zelda 2 never get compared to Dark Souls, even though those games really do share a lot of mechanics, dynamics, and even kinds of fun with Dark Souls. Just goes to show you that sometimes things like that just get missed by the general public.
Nice.
Some kinds of fun just don't go together. This depends partially on the intensity of the individual kind of fun, but here are some examples. The first is high challenge combined with basically anything. Yeah, this one's pretty broad. Really it has to do with the game being so brutal that it ruins everything else. Here are some examples and the kinds of fun that challenge ruins. Cuphead and Sensation. This game is beautiful and would be cool to look at all the animations, but you can't because you need to focus on not getting hit. Pizza Tower and Discovery. This game wants you to speedrun it, but if you speedrun it, you'll miss all the secrets. Go slow and you'll feel like you're playing the game wrong. Not too great of an example, but that is the feeling I had while playing Pizza Tower. Papers, Please and Expression. I want to play this game because I like the idea of making moral choices. Turns out though that game puts you on a time limit that punishes you for thinking too long and has a tutorial that is very confusing and also has a time limit. Ended up quitting that game out of frustration. Then I found Death and Taxes, which is the same kind of moral choice game, but without a timer or a failure state in general. Ended up enjoying that game a lot more. Dark Souls and basically anything. Dark Souls has a lot of kinds of fun, but enjoying any of them can be difficult if you aren't very good at it. And this has disappointed many people, as they would have loved to play the game for any of the other kinds of fun, but couldn't because the challenge kept getting in the way. Now you may think that people like that should just get good, but you may want to swallow your words, because I'll be dealing with you in the next hot take. Alright, now let's check out some other conflicting kinds of fun. Fellowship and Competition. That one is pretty self-explanatory. In a team game with competition, it can sometimes happen that players may get into competition with their teammates. Just look how in Call of Duty, players will often fight over kills with their teammates, because only the player that gets the final hit will gain progress towards their killstreak bonus. Kill Stealer, they'll yell at each other. It's barbaric, but it's all the fault of the game designers. Narrative and Expression. Again, pretty self-explanatory. Creating a consistent narrative in a game where the player can create their own character is pretty hard. Try picking one or the other if you don't want to do a bunch of extra work.
面白い冗談ですね。
Epic.
Nope.
It's an old discussion. Should Dark Souls have an easy mode? You could argue it already has mechanics that give players an easier time, like the Ring of Life protection. You could argue that you don't have to beat the game to enjoy it. Or you could say that people shouldn't play challenging games if they don't like challenge. But that's just the thing. There exist a lot of people who do want to play Dark Souls, but don't like challenge. Dark Souls has more kinds of fun than just challenge. It has discovery, companionship, narrative, submission, expression, sensation, competition. And there are a lot of people who would love to experience all these kinds of fun, but they can't because the game has such a strong focus on challenge that it can't be ignored. This is what I was talking about with how challenge can ruin other kinds of fun. However, I don't think that an easy mode would solve the problem. As I said before, it doesn't matter how easy a game is, it will still be challenging. It doesn't matter how little damage enemies do, having enemies attack you at all while you're trying to explore an area is just annoying. What games like Dark Souls really need is a tourist mode. A mode where enemies don't aggro unless attacked. One where players can go anywhere they want and purchase any item and just explore or mess around. A mode like this would also help content creators. In one of my last videos, I had to reenact a lot of my experiences with Dark Souls, as I didn't record them as they happened. I thought about playing the game from the beginning, but it would have taken too much time to replay all those segments. But if there was some kind of creative mode, I could have just bought some poison darts, run my ass over to Havel, and redo the fight. And it's not like a mode like this has never been created before. Minecraft's creative mode is basically a tourist mode. Here you can build anything, spawn any enemy, do whatever you want. Meanwhile, I don't think I've ever heard survival mode players complain creative mode players need to get good. So basically, don't bully people for not liking the same kinds of fun as you, and developers should try to create modes that cater to different audiences. A few years ago, the Animal Crossing fandom got into a fight over whether moving the clock forward was considered cheating. Of course, people can play the games however they like, but I think this problem could also be solved with the kinds of play. Players that think moving the clock forward is cheating mostly play the game for the fantasy of living a quiet and simple life, and moving the clock forward breaks their immersion. While people who do move the clock forward play mostly for expression, since they want to unlock all the furniture as soon as possible, so they can customize their island exactly how they want. Really, Animal Crossing is another game that could use a creative mode, so people don't have to wait to unlock all the stuff and can just be creative. Another game series that has this problem is Pokemon. Many people like the direction Legends Arceus took the series in. I don't like it because I think the semi-action battle system ruins the strategy aspects of the game, and I think the game is too much of a Skinner box with its grindy Pokédex missions and the way it conditions players to just move from piece of candy to piece of candy. But I do understand the appeal. This game really delivers on the kind of fun of fantasy. The Pokemon in this game are big and they move around in the overworld and they follow you, and all that makes the game seem more realistic. Makes it feel more like you are in the Pokemon world. The perfect solution would be to have one developer make classic Pokemon games, and another developer to make more games like Legends Arceus. I think in general, Game Freak should just go back to making 2D Pokemon games, since those are way easier to crank out within a year. But since the Pokemon company kind of super sucks, that is unlikely to happen.
Kazuya Mishima wins.
Recently, I said that games like Rogue, The Binding of Isaac, and Slay the Spire should be called risk assessment games instead of roguelikes. But now I'd like to explain how this dynamic comes together and is different from other kinds of risk-reward dynamics. Games like this are primarily known for having procedural generation and permadeath, and it's the interaction of these two mechanics that create the risk assessment dynamic. The randomness of the procedural generation creates uncertainty. You don't know what's coming up, while the permadeath creates a sense of finality. If you assess the risk wrong, you won't get a second chance. It's the combination of these two mechanics interacting that creates the true risk assessment experience. As stated in a previous video, Minecraft also has procedural generation and can have permadeath. But the randomness of the world doesn't really matter most of the time, as enemies are far more likely to kill you than some random part of the environment. Unless you're digging straight down, I guess. Even then, the player can get pretty familiar with their environment and can always backtrack to safer locations and get more resources. In the real risk assessment games, resources are often used as part of the risk assessment and are finite, so clearly making a good risk assessment dynamic requires more mechanics than just procedural generation and permadeath.
Kaboom! Sploosh!
Sometimes you play a game that has a mechanic where you just say, that mechanic is terrible. It should be thrown away and never used again. This is a real throw the baby out with the bathwater sentiment, as any mechanic can be good as long as it's used right. One reason that certain mechanics can fall flat is because they're used in a game with a conflicting kind of fun. Take limited inventories for example. Recently, Starfield used this mechanic in the worst way, as players were encouraged to collect everything, even though encumbrance prevented them from carrying everything. And then it was also a huge hassle to sell all of it. Of course, that's not to say this mechanic was done well in their other games like in Skyrim and such, just less noticeable. Really, it's the kind of fun that these games are trying to deliver that just doesn't gel well with this mechanic. These games are all about discovery, and having to pause your exploration to backtrack to your house to drop stuff off is just annoying. The only thing that this mechanic is good at is providing challenge by limiting which weapons and resources you can carry for combat. The best example of that mechanic used for challenge are survival horror games like Resident Evil. Of course, there are plenty of other games that limit your resources just in different ways. Pokémon can only carry one health item, and the Chosen Undead only has so many Estus flasks. However, these games do have infinite inventory for items you pick up while exploring, so a good middle ground would be to limit the player's inventory management in combat in some way. Another controversial mechanic is breakable weapons. The idea of this mechanic is that the player can't rely on just one weapon and may have to scour the battlefield for different weapons. This makes them switch up their positioning and prevents them from getting too comfortable. Breath of the Wild does this mechanic rather poorly, as most of the time, the only weapons on the battlefield are sticks, which deal next to no damage and break just as easily. The good weapons are all inside treasure chests, so the best tactic is to hoard them. But this defeats the purpose, as you'll just switch to the next weapon immediately and will have to flee when you run out. This once again conflicts with the explorative aspects of the game, as you'll have to stop what you're doing to go find more weapons. This mechanic is done way better in Dead Rising, as pretty much every item in the environment is a weapon. Even the worst weapons are still effective, since all the zombies in the game are pretty weak. Resident Evil also does this better. Sure, weapons don't break, but they do run out of ammo. In boss fights, there is usually ammo for your current weapon, scattered around the arena. And even if you completely run out, you still have your knife, which isn't very strong, but at least it never breaks. So these mechanics are useful for creating challenge, but aren't great for discovery. The question on how to combine different genres often comes up on the internet. One way to answer this question is that most games already combine plenty of genres, especially if we accept that genres are just dynamics. Any modern game you can name easily has like 5 different genres. So in that case, you just have to figure out how to combine dynamics. The first step is to identify if the genres you want to combine provide similar kinds of fun. Platformer and first-person shooter go together well, since both provide the fun of challenge. Meanwhile, farming games and first-person shooters go together poorly, since people don't really play farming games for challenge but for submission. Another thing you can do is find out if genres have certain mechanics and dynamics in common. Slay the Spire is a great example of a card game combined with risk assessment. But why do they go together so well? I think a big part is that card games already contain a lot of risk and randomness, because every time you play, the deck is shuffled, and you won't know what cards you get when. Many card games also have what's called a sealed deck format, where players have to build a new deck using cards they find in a few freshly opened booster packs. This is very similar to how many risk assessment games give the player random weapons, resources, and power-ups. When you play Slay the Spire, you are continuously obtaining booster packs and adding cards to your deck. The devs did a great job recognizing the similarities between these game types and running with it. I wouldn't really worry too much about coming up with a completely new genre combination though. There is nothing wrong with staying with the tried and true combinations. Finding a new combination is impressive, sure, but don't lose any sleep over it. Do you need a jump to make a platformer? Not necessarily. First of all, the dynamic of up-downing can be created through many different ways. The game Bionic Commando does not have a jump. Instead, the character moves up by pulling themselves up with their arm and moves down because of gravity. Meanwhile, 5V only has the mechanic of gravity, but combines this with the ability to reverse gravity to create up-downing. Plenty of games also use ladders or vines to allow the player to move up and down. But what if you want to make a platformer without up-downing? Would that even be possible? Well, in Super Mario Maker, there are levels where you are not allowed to hit the ground after leaving it. And this win condition can be used to create levels where the player can't jump. So instead they just have to walk on top of the platforms. Of course, the platforms can still move Mario up and down, but we can easily make a level where even that doesn't happen, effectively making a level that only uses the first dimension. So really it's not up-downing that makes a platformer, but simply movement of any kind in any dimension around pieces of terrain. Now, I could go on dissecting this further, like what if a platformer game has no platforms whatsoever, but my brain is kind of fried right now and this video is getting too long, so I'll end it here. I hope that my explanations were somewhat useful to you, at least more useful than other people's explanations of the aesthetics of play, since that would mean I didn't waste my time. My final note is that I'm going to try my best to keep referring back to the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics and the kinds of fun as much as possible. I truly think that this theory can be super useful in understanding game design. And I don't want it to be some set it and forget it theory that gets forgotten by people immediately after they learn it, like I originally did. So yeah, thanks for watching, and all that stuff, and give me the likeys and the subscribies to fill my tummy and help me sleep at night. Goodbye, F a monkey. Those monkeys are funny.